Hey, everybody, it's Dan Porterfield. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm coming to you live from our campus in Aspen, and we have a great turnout of colleagues together for our Foundation President's Roundtable, which is an annual event that we do led by Jane Wales that features prominent leaders from the nation's top charitable foundations for in-depth interviews on philanthropy and on emerging issues in the philanthropic space, and there are always a lot of them. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by Sam Gill, who's the president and CEO of the Doris Duke Foundation. And Sam joined the foundation in 2021. And a number of Aspen programs have worked with the Doris Duke Foundation over the years, and we're very excited that our colleague Lola, who leads our program in entrepreneurship and health and well-being globally came from the Doris Duke Foundation. And prior to Doris Duke, Sam was a senior vice president and chief program officer at the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, where he oversaw more than $100 million a year of grant making, and that must have been incredibly interesting and complex, and I hope very edifying. So conducting the interview with Sam is Jane Wales, our vice president, who leads our program on philanthropy and social innovation. We look forward to their conversation and how philanthropic organizations can help create the conditions where people can thrive, and to learning about Doris Duke Foundation's work to build bridges and support children and families, among many other critical areas. So Sam, thank you for joining us. The audience that's here today, colleagues from across the Institute, thank you for being here. And let's turn it over to Jane and Sam.
Thank you, Dan. I'm glad you're out there preparing the way for a series of programs that are underway in Aspen that are exciting. So Sam, thank you for joining us. And there is a common thread in that resume that Dan Porterfield just cited, and that is the effort to strengthen democracy. Its norms, its institutions, and its outcomes. And so in fact, at the Knight Foundation, not only were you working to support pluralism in the arts, but also to support the communities and nonprofits that they serve. You also have participated, though, as a volunteer in some commissions and as author of various articles. So I'm going to ask you about that as well. And then finally, leading the Doris Duke Foundation, you've taken this effort to strengthen democracy and its institutions to there. I'm going to start where the Knight brothers started themselves, and that is in the role of the engaged citizen. The notion that at the core of our democracy is that engaged citizen, that they join the PTA, they respond to the blood drive, they in every way they contribute to community and thereby build trust and a capacity to self-govern. So start there. Say a word about the support you give to individuals and the organizations they lead.
Sure, and I think you know, something that for the Knight brothers, it was really the informed and engaged citizen, and that they saw both as being really important. I should say, by the way, I just thank you for having me and for the opportunity to join in this conversation, and thanks to the looks like 75+ people who are tuning in. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this incredible ongoing series of conversations. You know, I think there's the broad theory of philanthropy, and then there's the ways in which the places I've been privileged to work have applied that theory. I think, you know, the broad theory of philanthropy, I think, is that there is the aggregation, the private aggregation of wealth guided by private intent, but broadly oriented toward the public interest, is an important source of social innovation. And I think if that's true, it's true with respect to what you just described, which is either investing directly in people to be more informed and engaged, or in investing in the structures that enable people to be more informed and engaged. And that's probably a bit overbroad, but if we look at the history of organized institutional philanthropy in this country, I think we'd see a lot of that theory at work. The Knight Foundation was particularly interested in kind of two things. So one was the information side of that, and the Knight brothers had made their money, I think in their minds, quite rightly, in helping people in communities to have the information they needed to govern themselves. And I think Knight Foundation today is really grappling with how to live up to that when the newspaper isn't necessarily the primary or dominant way that happens, in which some of the challenges to being informed have changed in character or shape or magnitude. And then the other way the Knight Foundation tried to do that was particularly in a set of communities where the Knight brothers had accrued their wealth, had aggregated their wealth, investing in the parts of civic engagement that don't always show up formally. So Knight was relatively less invested in, creating opportunities for people to vote or the political infrastructure for making one's voice heard, but was very interested in the life of the arts or the civic and social life of the community. At Doris Duke Foundation, we don't think of our formula as really focusing on the individual as such, but I think similarly, you could look at ways that we support individuals directly, or we could support the structures in which individuals are able to be informed and engaged. So we're one of the leading independent funders of performing artists, not the arts generally, but actual artists. And that's really helping a group of people whose engagement we value as a public good. Having a creativity abundant is something we really value in the society in which we live, and we associate with being in a thriving democracy. Helping individual artists to be able to do that work in sustainable ways, and in ways that are scale heights of potential creativity. On the other hand, our investments in environmental conservation, where we're also one of the leading national funders, we've really invested in the infrastructure that helps people to make their voices heard. So for example, for 25 years, we've been investing in what's called conservation finance, which is basically, helping communities to put conservation on the ballot, with the idea that if you give people a choice about environmental conservation, they often will choose to support it and to allocate scarce public resources. So that's, two different contexts, but a very similar way of applying this independent philanthropic capital to support our democracy.
And as part of it, you also kind of define what community can mean. That is to say, I believe that it's in your environmental work, you've been supporting efforts to engage BIPOC communities in achieving, a much better level of conservation by our state as well as by our citizens. Say something about that decision, that choice.
Yeah, I think there is a part of a liberal democracy that's about treating everybody the same. Everybody's vote counts for the same, no matter who they are. And to the extent that we consider those structures unjust, it's that in some way someone is being treated differently. Their vote counts for less, their voice counts for less. I think there's another part of liberal democracy, which is saying if everybody is supposed to have access to the same goods, to be able to realize their rights and their opportunities in a roughly comparable way, then we need to attend to differences. And what we need to be responsive to is the ways in which people are different. They're differently situated vis-a-vis each other. We do a lot of work across all of our program areas and at our two centers that serve the public, Duke Farms in New Jersey and Shangri-La in Hawaii, in thinking critically about what voices have traditionally been marginalized and excluded, either excluded from formal structures of equality and participation, or excluded and having relevant differences not attended to. Conservation is a great example of one. So, in many communities, conservation has been the tool through which to marginalize certain communities. So we're going to take these lands from you and set them aside for conservation has been a technology of expropriation of lands from tribal and indigenous populations in this country. To some extent, it's part of the project of extermination and erasure and dispossession. Similarly, in a lot of urban communities, saying conservation means this particular set of issues has led to a lot of what we would call in our contemporary political conversation, environmental justice issues. So examples of where we have actually allowed deleterious environmental impacts, but allowed them because they affect certain kinds of communities that have been relatively discriminated against. So, that is something that we think a lot about in our work. Our view is the pathway forward here is not to pit kind of excellence against equity, but rather to say you need both. So some of the highest priority, most ecologically significant projects in this country are also projects where we have really important work to do in listening to and prioritizing and supporting voices that have been historically marginalized on their own terms. So it's not about coming in and saying, we've decided what the important ecological projects are. It's actually listening to communities of color in urban areas saying, here's the environmental projects we want to work on and the reasons why we want to work on them, and then putting our resources in service of that agenda.
There's another issue area where you play a very large role, where the foundation plays a very large role, and that is in child welfare. And one would think that that's an area where there'd be a great deal of agreement. That sense that we should be putting the child first, both in terms of our approach to healthcare, our approach to education, even our sense of family. Say something about the work you do there.
Right.
And whether I'm right that this is an area where a lot of consensus can be built, or is it a contentious area?
Yeah, I think there are elements of consensus and elements of contention, and it's in some ways it's a debate, an ideological debate that I think feels a little nostalgic in that there are some ideological differences, but they're not polarized in the kind of superficial way that so many issues are today. So Doris Duke had a special interest in helping to reduce child neglect and abuse. And our journey, like many foundations, and Lola Edidoka, who now works at Aspen, and who we're proud of as having been at Doris Duke, led for about a decade our journey from really narrowly trying to address child abuse where it occurs to more kind of what we would call upstream, to addressing some of the fundamental causes of child abuse and neglect, which are very often socioeconomic. And now, what under the leadership of our current program director, Juyun Chang, we are working on trying to identify how the actual child protection system, so the system that's called on when there are concerns about abuse or neglect, can do a better job at supporting other kinds of child well-being. So for those of you who are familiar, that system is really designed to kind of address one question: should a child stay in a household or not? And the way in which it addresses that question tends to be experienced by families as very adversarial. It's an investigation into the family. And so what we've been exploring is, there are so many other things that lead that system to look at a family. But very few children, fortunately, appropriately, need to be removed from a home. It's a huge intrusion by the state in a family, and it's a very traumatic thing for a child. But many more children kind of bump into the system because there's some other element of what it takes to raise kids effectively that is being challenged. Like anyone who has children knows, like even under the best economic circumstances, the work of parenting is hard. So sometimes under more challenging economic or social circumstances, it's even harder to do. And there may be times when parents are more challenged than others. And how can we support them? So what we've been thinking about, what we've been working on is, how to create a system that is more responsive to instances where a family's well-being needs to be supported, but the answer is not removal. And part of that means not only better responding to those families in the first instance, like seeing what's going on, detecting what's going on in the household, but then also providing interventions that are actually effective. A lot of those interventions should not be led by the state. They should be led by other good community organizations, many of which already exist. And this gets to where sort of the contention is. I think an area of kind of bipartisan or cross-ideological consensus in this country is that some level of child safety and well-being is a public good. It's a thing that the government should invest in, because we all agree that it's important that it should exist, and the market and individual behavior alone isn't always adequate to making sure that it exists in the right abundance. The challenge is usually, well, what should the role of the state be? And so the debate will be about, well, kind of what is too intrusive on behalf of the state and what is not intrusive enough. And an area, though, of really interesting consensus is that a place that many critics of the current child protection system on the left and the right agree is that, too much state intrusion can be a bad thing. So on the right, there is an idea that, look, these can't be top-down solutions that come from the state. It's got to be communities coming together and supporting individuals and supporting families, and that communities know best about what the families in those communities need. On the left, what people will point out is this big statist apparatus makes that system more vulnerable to being instrumentalized on behalf of things like racism. So, there are really clear patterns about for which families their kids are taken away and which ones aren't. And so a lot of people see the child protection system as sort of the apogee of the coercive state, that is policing one kind of parent and saying, you're not fit to be a parent, as a way of policing ultimately along lines of race within the community. So, and that kind of bipartisan consensus, even though the arguments are motivated by different things, is actually a really exciting opportunity to say, well, what is the right role of the state ultimately in supporting families and children in ways that respond to the real challenges of parenting, but also live up to our highest ideals?
So you've referred to the child protection system as a system. You've referred to communities, which are in and of themselves a system, and you've referred to racism as a potential system. So let me just zero in on one of them. And this is an area where the Aspen Institute and your foundation interact, and that is in the sort of intergenerational transfer of poverty. The tendency the fact that, in fact, it's sort of demonstrated a fact that single parents living in poverty are most likely to have, their children are most likely to live in poverty going forward. Tell me how that system can be broken.
I wish I had all the answers. I wish I had all the answers. We were involved in under Lola's leadership, actually investing in more than one study by the national academies about both what intergenerational poverty is, how it's constituted, what comprises it, as well as some of the solutions for addressing intergenerational poverty. And there's still active debate about both of those things, about what exactly makes poverty intergenerational, what the consequences of it being an intergenerational problem are, and what we can do to address it. I'm not an expert. I think, to my mind, what I think I can speak with some modest authority on is, what should philanthropy do in particular in response to the reality that poverty is intergenerational. And I think it means, a couple things for foundations. I mean, I think one is, that we have to recognize, that our investments in addressing issues like poverty aren't happening in isolation, and that we are intervening in a set of challenges that individuals or families or communities might face that have intergenerational dimensions, that the outcomes in one generation are going to some extent determine and shape the outcomes in another, and that needs to inform what our investment strategies are. What does it mean to give time limited or one-time capital in the context of a problem that's intergenerational? One of the upshots of this is that you see in a number of foundations that are broadly investing in what we call human services and social policy, now do more place-based investing. And I don't know that it's the right thing to do or the only thing to do, but I think it's a reflection of this insight that poverty is intergenerational, which is, if it's intergenerational, one of the ways to counteract that the intergenerational problem is to support the community, and that if the community is stronger, its ability to support people across lines of generation, the ability for the community to make investments and provide supports for families that can continue across generations. The theory is that's increased. I think that's one responsive thing, that philanthropy has done with respect to the issue of intergenerational poverty. There's obviously questions about, other things that a foundation can do. Our attitude in particular around child well-being is, if we have a system that is more responsive to the wide range of ways in which intergenerational poverty can manifest, then we can, as a society, better counteract those things. So that's what's motivating us to try to think about, well, how can a child protection system that's mostly focused on the question of removal begin to take on effectively, or at least detect more effectively the wider range of challenges that people are facing, right? Like, so that's the mechanics of intergenerationality, right? So you've got a family that has less wealth for intergenerational reasons that may just lead to, at some period of time, just not quite adequately supporting the child in the way that he, she, or they needs. And that might lead someone to confront a system. The kid doesn't need to leave the house, but if we don't address that, then the intergenerational effect becomes significant in the life of the child in a way that we may have, as a society, have otherwise been able to respond to.
So you've referred to communities and to investing directly in those communities, as opposed to, or maybe alongside, policy work or the generation of knowledge, such as that which comes from the National NSA, for the National Science Foundation, NSF. We think of communities as being the place where democratic decision making is practiced. You know, the town hall meeting, or the decision to deal with an immediate problem, the tendency to, you know, the willingness to join various organizations to play that role. Say something about we tend to do that through nonprofit organizations, right? Say something about the role of nonprofits. They are among the more trusted aspects of our society and our democracy. How important are they? Or should we be looking at the other ways in which people give and volunteer?
Yeah, I think there's an important category question here too that's worth opening up. So I think one thing we think about our democracy is that it requires and benefits from a very strong civil society. You know, that the work that we do that isn't governed by the market and isn't in service of market imperatives, and the work that we do together through formal structures of government is, in a sense, an incomplete expression of a healthy, engaged, and democratic life. And that idea is, very libertarian. It's very Tocquevillian. It's very federalist, right? That we have an instinct about our democracy that it may not only come from below, but it in part comes from below. That we express ourselves and participate in the democracy as individuals or within sub-national units. That innovation happens in community, and because conditions are different, and so they lead to different sorts of solutions, and we all benefit from that pluralism of solutions. There's a lot of different intuitions that come together to support that idea. I think that within that paradigm or within that frame of reference, both of the things that you said are true. Like, it is true that a nonprofit structure that is solving problems and that is part of the fabric of the society is a useful thing in our democracy. And it's also true that individuals having ways to express themselves in the life of their community, whether that's charitably express themselves by volunteering or socially express themselves by joining a club. And this is kind of classic Bob Putnam, bowling alone, social capital. That's also important, and it might be important directly, that contributes to the democracy. It might just be important instrumentally. It makes you feel connected to this thing called a national community because of the way that you experience a national community. I think there's another thing that we tend to, that is a little more nostalgic, which is that, and therefore to be cautious about, which is that we sort of see in the town hall meeting, something that we're not seeing in other structures of democracy that we like, that has a democratic association for us. I think it's important to be careful about that. I think that if those really active settings do something for people that's important to the democracy, that's good. But those settings aren't themselves democracy, and they have their own problems, right? I mean, California would be the best example of sort of direct democracy run amok. And the other sorts of formal structures that feel a little more, from which we feel a little more alienated, are still really important. They're really important structures, and having ways to be reminded of the value of those structures, having ways to hold those structures accountable to make sure that they're delivering against their purported value. I think that that's really important too. Foundations can be useful in both. I think foundations can invest directly in what's happening in the layers of a democracy that really are imminent within community, and foundations can invest in the structural work that's a little bit more removed. I think the question a foundation has to ask is, what problem are we trying to solve, and what problems are we really good at solving? The question we have to ask as a whole sector is, are we accounting for precisely that breadth of activity that comprises in its totality a healthy democracy?
We've talked about the engaged citizen and the vehicles through which they engage and the platforms they use, like a town hall, or vehicles like nonprofits that they have. But the number of, we've been seeing over the past, oh my gosh, since about 2010, that the number of volunteers has dwindled. There are other measures like voting patterns, but when it comes to sort of joining the PTA, et cetera, or giving blood, the fact is that more volunteer hours are donated, but it's by fewer volunteers. And this is alongside more dollars being donated, but by fewer donors. Now you can say the dollars question may simply be a reflection of the concentration of wealth. But the question relating to sort of volunteerism going down, does that suggest a concentration of agency? Is that sense that you can make a difference? And what would it mean? What does it mean if the average American doesn't think he or she can make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, my hypothesis is that it's two things, both of which would be problematic for different reasons. One is, and this is I'm not a social scientist. Nor do I purport to be one on TV. I think one of the challenges, I think, is that this is a symptom of a broader disconnection. And I think it's interesting that so many of the kinds of civic association that show up in studies of social capital formation or the deterioration of social capital, are about altruistic endeavors. It's the bowling league that also picks up litter next to the highway. It's the church group that's also providing the social service. And I think what that says is not only is our altruistic acts of generosity useful in the society, but they're also affectively useful to individuals. They make us feel good, and they make us feel more connected to other people. And at their best, obviously, they can be in really critical moments of recognition. Like you can have all kinds of ideas about the person that you're helping that implicitly lower them from you. It's different when you confront them and have to help them and have to see them really as equals to you, who may be facing different circumstances, in which you can provide a direct help. So that's sort of one thing, which is, are we actually, losing altruism because we're no longer providing people with these adequate venues to engage that maybe in the first instance weren't there to be able to generate, acts of generosity and altruism. I think the second challenge, that we've grappled with is, it's not all a story of loss. Digital technology has displaced where a lot of the activity that was happening in person was happening. And we can have a kind of nostalgic conversation that says, how do we go back to in-person? There's obviously some value for in-person contact. And I don't think it's good that young people are reporting the sort of rates of, or the absence of in-person contact to the extent that they are. But it's also the case that we should say, well, what are those good things that were happening in person that may or may not be happening online? And how can we design online spaces in order to provide for those things while taking advantage of the other things online is good at doing? Like online is really good at reducing the transaction costs. Online is really good at helping you connect to other communities. There was an article, the most recent census kind of, and I forget what the name of the product is, on the rate of the abundance of transgender individuals. You saw this sharp increase. And usually social scientists are very tentative when these censuses come out about, well, correlation isn't causation, and we're still figuring out what's happening in society. People are very unequivocal, like this is about digital technology. And it's that you have people who felt very isolated from communities now feeling that they have a community. And so that's a good thing. That's an affordance of technology that is serving a pro-social end. So I think that's the other thing we got to think about is, where are acts of generosity and altruism relocating? And how do we make sure that those things continue to do the good work of supporting our democracy, even if they have different exigencies associated with them that we have to respond to?
We definitely saw the rise of mutual aid societies, of sort of self-organized communities to help folks during the height of COVID. In essence, to do grocery runs, to people to get their vaccine, et cetera, as well as at the same time, what you've referred to, and that's giving online. Through GoFundMe or PayPal. In each of these cases, the giving and the volunteering is not mediated by nonprofits, right?
Right.
And so, do we have the data that can tell us that in fact there isn't really a reduction in these acts of generosity? They've just gone through different channels or no channels at all. They've become direct. Or do we need data? Because we don't know. We know how much was going on of direct giving during COVID. We don't know how much it was before. We weren't measuring those efforts. Is there a big data need here?
I'm sure there is. I'm sure if you and I don't know the answer to that question, it would be helpful to find out. I think there's another question it raises too, which is, does the role of nonprofits need to change? Our belief that civil society is a really important part of our democracy, I don't think is our belief that it necessarily is an important part of democracy only as in the analog context or only with predominant business models. It might be that the kinds of work that nonprofits need to do retains perennial value, but it needs to be done differently. How can nonprofits be part of that mediating layer? A good example, right, would be Giving Tuesday. Giving Tuesday is actually a very thin layer. They're not running a lot of the Giving Tuesday campaigns. They're providing kind of the resources to help individual organizations or individual communities across a bunch of different topics and across the world to use the Giving Tuesday idea in order to catalyze acts of individual altruism. But to your point, one of the core things they do is collect and aggregate that data. And so that's a good example of both, right? Of both seeing the need for the data and seeing that in a digitally enabled world, the role of the nonprofit is different than it may have been.
What I should probably add is that the Gates Foundation and the Mott Foundation have invested in significant ways in supporting these Giving Tuesday efforts to capture the data. So even in this world of direct giving and direct volunteering, organized philanthropy has a large role to play.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to take you to perhaps another moment in which you've expressed your point of view, and that is in an article that you co-wrote with CEOs of other foundations, ranging from the Ford Foundation to the Charles Koch Foundation, and standing together. And this was a statement on behalf of what's referred to in the article as philanthropic pluralism, or others might call it ideological pluralism. Saying the argument that we all have a right, and maybe a responsibility as citizens, and certainly as leaders of foundations, to build knowledge and advance knowledge, and sometimes advance our point of view. And the article is interesting in that it really is arguing not for my right or not for yours, but for the other guy or woman, for those who disagree with me. Tell me something about sort of why was it necessary to write this article? What was the problem it sought to solve? And who is the potential audience? Who are you addressing when you say, this is important, we believe in it, understand the role of philanthropy in advancing or acknowledging or even celebrating ideological pluralism?
Yeah, I think I think the second question is easier to answer than the first, which is who is the audience. I think I don't want to speak for my co-authors. I can speak for myself, but these were all issues that were discussed. I think my view is that this is a really important time for elected officials in particular, who set the rules of the game for independent foundations and for foundation leaders to really think critically about what our role is. And that, by the way, is inevitable. We are in a very populist moment. And for obvious reasons, populist moments are moments in which people pay attention to philanthropy. The 1969 Tax Reform Act, which largely governs the distribution requirements of major independent foundations, comes out of a set of populist political movements and debates that are happening in the mid 60s. That's the time when people ask questions about wealth and what the limits of wealth aggregation should be and who wealth should be accountable to. And specifically in this moment, we've seen some elected officials, make an issue out of foundations. And the argument that is largely advanced is, this is unaccountable capital that is driving a very particular ideological agenda. And they've got one thing right: this is unaccountable capital. That's its primary strength. This is the most independent form of capital in the world. It has no natural constituent. The trustees are, for all intents and purposes, the owners of the capital. They answer to no one as long as they're working within the circumscriptions of the law. But there's no investor who says, this is how I want you to use my money. And there's no political constituents who says, I put you in office, or you are indirectly accountable to me because you're hired by the people I put in office. And therefore I have some claim on you. And I think to sort of get to the first question of sort of what are we trying to address, to me, there's two really important arguments that the piece makes. I think one is a general argument about how you get innovation and experimentation in a society that is defined by its pluralism, which is that you don't in the first instance seek to disqualify. You may disagree with vehemently in the first instance, but ultimately that crossing of swords is really important. That is really important for sort of forging and shaping our democracy. And so one of the things, in my view, the article does is seeks to illuminate the stakes of a national discourse that is very focused on disqualification and the appropriate terms of disqualification. And there may be times when disqualification is the important instinct, but is it the first impulse? I think the second thing the piece tries to do is to make a very specific argument about the role of philanthropy in an environment in which we are asking questions about the costs and benefits of pluralism and the ways in which different kinds of pluralism are different, and they aren't all alike, and they're not all morally equivalent. And that is to say, as the most independent capital that we can imagine, the particular role of philanthropy is to bring different views into being. Philanthropy a lot of people think of philanthropy as risk capital. Well, what is risk capital? Risk capital is capital that goes to the idea or the point of view or the way of doing things that the market and government alone are not providing enough support to, or that civil society is currently constituted isn't providing enough support to. It is the minority view, whether that's a view about what a problem is, about why a problem is important, or about how to solve a problem.
You've been, or the authors have been criticized, and the thesis has been criticized. What have been the dominant arguments, but what have been the smart audiences arguments that weren't made, that you sort of wish you sort of thought, well, here's a vulnerability, attack it on these grounds?
It's a fair question. I think one I want to give more thought to. I'm sure informed to some extent, probably by some of the feedback that we get from this session. I think to me there are kind of two related arguments that are most common. One is that not all views are morally equivalent, and views that are morally blameworthy, ought to be disqualified. And that in not to disqualify them is to create a false equivalence between blameworthy moral views and praiseworthy moral views. I think an extension of that argument that has been made is that philanthropy in particular has a special obligation to take on and disqualify those views that are bound up in the very existence of private capital that is this large, and in some cases, the very specific histories of this capital, right? So, to the extent that this money was gained by contributing to systems of discrimination and disadvantage, then it has a special obligation to ally itself with specific actions that can, undo, dismantle, respond to those systems. And I think depending on how those arguments are presented, there is something to them to be responded to. I think that the trickiest conversation, I think, and so to you, what argument should be made is actually to have that discussion about race in particular. I think race in particular is a topic, in which arguments about comity and civility, which by the way aren't arguments that are forwarded in the piece, but are often associated with creating the space for pluralism. That arguments about comity and civility, have a very sordid track record of being used to silence and to diffuse and to undermine the very good substantive warrants for arguments about racial injustice or its absence, right? Like in some ways, this is the central insight of Letter from a Birmingham Jail by, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? Which is the problem of racism is the problem of the white moderate, the person who isn't for these systems, but is not sufficiently motivated to take them on. And so what, he says in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, and this is the name of the publication of the NAACP, is you've got to create a crisis. You create a crisis and such that one can't look away, and such that one recognizes that indeed my inaction is the thing that enables, police using dogs to actually judicially engage in violence against communities that are protesting for their rights. And so I think that's a good critique. At what point is the kind of argument that we're making make it difficult to foment a social crisis when we need a social crisis in order to respond to real injustice in our society?
I want to turn to some of the questions that were raised by the audience. And one of them relates to the generation of knowledge and acting on knowledge, and refers to the National Academy of Sciences report on childhood poverty. We know, for example, that the child's tax break during COVID actually reduced the number of children in poverty by half. So we've seen, we've got the knowledge has been generated, the experiments being run. We know it works. But that was a one-year program, right? So what is the role of philanthropy? Does philanthropy have an important role to play when it comes to advocating for both generating the knowledge, but also advocating for what works?
Yeah. I think this is a good example where I think it's, give me all the above. I think that, again, to me, philanthropy is engaged in social demonstration. Philanthropy is risk capital that exists to identify ideas about how to make society better or how to solve problems in the society. And again, those ideas can be that there is a problem, the nature of a problem, how to address a problem, what it takes to take an intervention to a larger scale. And so it de-risks action at scale by covering the learning cost or by increasing incentives to act or increasing disincentives for inaction. This would be a good example where you've got some of all of those things. I think, mechanically speaking, it is true that and by the way, it's a mechanical relationship. The poverty is defined as an income threshold, and if you get people over that income threshold, you've gotten them out of poverty. And so that observation is a mechanical observation, but it is true. And so one role of philanthropy can be the salience of the idea has been demonstrated. So now we need to demonstrate the stakes. We have to create incentives for action and disincentives for inaction, and that's philanthropic investment in public policy processes. How do we make visible? How do we that the success was had? How do we create incentives for different people to come together? What are the pathways to make those incentives real and have bite, among policymakers? And that work is paying off, right? Like you now see there's a lot of policy proposals on the right that, whether we think they're the right idea or not, kind of follow from what we learned through the experiment of the expansion of the child tax credit over, Mitt Romney has proposed, a version of this, et cetera. Then there's sort of another question, which is, well, why did that happen? What is it about the material support that actually changes the way that people are living, that poverty is a correlate to, that poverty is seeking to describe? And I don't think that work has been exhausted. I don't think that we know exactly how the child tax credit improved the lives of children. We do think that children and families that have access to more resources, particularly over a certain threshold called the poverty line, do better. And we've got a lot of evidence for that. But it would be really useful to know, well, how did that evidence, or what we think it's told us, manifest in the context of this? And it's a great experiment, right? We got no benefit to benefit, and then benefit to no benefit. That's what a social scientist would call kind of ideal conditions for understanding something. So I don't think just because we've got a lot to advocate for doesn't mean that we've exhausted the totality of useful evidence and knowledge that we might gather. And that by the way, is what a technocratic democracy built on Enlightenment rationalism is all about. Like, it's all about solving problems with the information we've got, but not getting tired of generating new knowledge and new information to continue to improve the scope of problems we're taking on and the efficacy of solutions that we're applying.
And new contributors to that
Totally.
because there's so many of your programs at Doris Duke, but it was also true in other points in your resume, have been haven't had the level of diversity and pluralism that one would hope. Just say something about the audience revolution, which is something that I don't know, but which is associated with you by the questioner. But the idea is to bring more diversity to the arts.
How can broader and more diverse participation in the arts provide more forums to debate ideas in a democracy, as well as to build a stronger civic identity? Well, thanks, Michael. I'm so glad you've joined, and what a great question. Look, I mean, I think that the arts is one of the ways that we express our civic identity. It might be the place where we go to have conversations about the community in which we live. Arts can be powerful in mediating place to talk about the values of our community. So that's the Mellon Foundation has made the enormous investments in thinking more critically about monuments as political speech acts, and how to monuments have been subordinated to the project of discrimination in this country, and to appropriating and telling history in a way that inures to the benefit of the discriminator. And how can we reimagine monuments as telling a more liberatory story about social justice? But monuments are a form of art, and some of the great monuments they've invested in are like far more sublime, than some of what they replaced, or what had been there, or what wasn't there at all. And I think that's the power of art, to bring us together to have a really critical conversation about who we are and what our history is, and what matters to us. So that's an example. Another example is that I think some people think of patronizing the arts as an expression of their commitment to community. And so if arts audiences aren't diverse, then what we're telling a whole bunch of people in the community is, you're not an investor. You're not an equity stakeholder in this community. And that too is a place, where we are deliberately, through the arts, either engaging in making our communities more homogenous, or we're just missing a great opportunity to make communities more heterogeneous because of what the arts tap into in terms of our kind of intrinsic desires and passions.
We also have a question that I think was inspired a little bit by our focus on data for a while back. And this questioner worries about the sort of qualification or quantification, I should say, of success. The tendency or the sense that organized philanthropy has become so focused on evidence that sometimes it misses the larger story of what's happened. There's also a timing element to this. When you give a one-year grant to advance equity, and you need to show the results during the time of the grant, show how equity has been advanced in 12 months. So both that sort of quantification, where sometimes it should be more subjective.
Well, I think I have two answers. One is a little more narrow and related just to sort of the work of being a donor and the work of taking funds from a donor. I think sometimes the implied weight of these things is not nearly as strong as the actual weight. So like I hear this critique, and I believe it. I believe that foundations are sending signals that we're giving you a one-year grant and you need to show societal transformation in a year. I'll tell you, inside the building, like I've been in two major foundations, those aren't the discussions we're having. We're not having discussions about this grant was a success or not because they did or didn't show societal transformation in a year. So, I think that it's incumbent on those who work at foundations to make sure like we're not engaging in the signaling if we don't believe these things just because it's an easy way to structure a report or a proposal process. And we should really scour our processes for examples of that. And I say that as an invitation to potential grantees, to not be daunted, by those things, and to not assume they correlate to how the foundation is actually assessing this stuff. And not every foundation is the same. And so some may do that, but some may not, and try to take them each as they come. I think the more fundamental question is like, what is quantification good for? And, I actually think we draw a false distinction between for-profit enterprises and not-for-profit enterprises to some extent. What institutions exist to do is to provide sustainable value. In a for-profit enterprise, that sustainable value needs to correlate to economic profit in order for them to stay in business, at least over the long run. And for a social enterprise, I suspect that it has to translate into sustainable social impact in order for that organization to stay in business or to have a right to stay in business over the long run. In both of those enterprises, over quantification is distorted. Like the big innovation challenge that big companies have is they're managing to their metrics, but their metrics are no longer proxies for value creation. And big corporate enterprises struggle with that. And they have the same discussion. They say, like, we're focused too much on the metrics and not on why it is that we're essential or should be essential to our customer. I think in philanthropy, it's the same thing. It's not, to me, it's not in the first instance about quantification or not. It is about clarity. And I think the place that foundations really fall down is not in having real clarity about what impact do we want to have, and then what organizations pursuing their own goals will do things that redound to that impact, whether it's a shared goal of us and the grantee, or whether it's just an alignment between the goal of the grantee and our goal. And that should be understood clearly. Now, whether the clarity of that understanding can be expressed qualitatively or quantitatively has everything to do with what the matter is. And so I think there is room for quantification in any enterprise. I think it's got to come in at the right place. What I don't like is the discussion that says we've become over quantified and you just can't, and social impact is just so underdetermined and too complex that there's just no way at all to be clear about it. That's the wrong antinomy. And I think that antinomy gives us an excuse to not be rigorous. Rigor is the thing. And the question is, which tool of rigor, qualification or quantification, do we want to use?
The next question I'd like to pull out of the list refers to your personal history. The family in which you were raised in Minnesota, the values that were expressed. And I mean, I guess what I would say is that it may have been a wonderful example of pluralism at its best, your family experience, but say something about your parents' origins, the way difference was addressed in your childhood.
Sure, and I see one of the commenters got a little bit about my own background wrong, so I'm happy for the chance to clarify. So I grew up in Minneapolis. My dad immigrated from India in the 60s and then made his life in the Midwest with my mom, who's from the Midwest originally, and that's the region that she came from. And then I have one older brother who has Down syndrome. So my experience is as a second generation American and as an American who's in a family where someone has, really identifiable badges of ethnic difference. My dad's a brown guy who wears a turban. And then I've also had some firsthand experience of a person who has a difference in ability that it also has, physical badges that people can see and can respond to. Those experiences have been really important in my own outlook about what I think my role in the society is, what makes for a more just society. They've certainly had an impact on my outlook about the places that I've worked and what their role and obligation is. I do think we're in a moment where we're asking really good and incisive questions about the kinds of experience that are important in organizations and that are important in the leadership of organizations. So, one of the big, we were talking about child tax credit and social policy, and one of the really big differences in that discussion is not just having the evidence, it's what evidence we have. And so we know there's now a much larger consensus that social policy needs to be formed at least in part shaped by what we would call lived experience, or what used to be called in the academy standpoint epistemology, which is that people affected directly by the policy should have their knowledge is valid too, and that it's a form of knowledge that is just as valid as some of the social scientific knowledge about whether this outcome happens or that outcome happens when you give these cash support. So to the question in the chat, I don't think I just represent a white male. It is true that I don't represent some other really important experiences, and I feel comfortable leading this organization, but I also feel really glad that this is a topic for discussion in the society that we live in today. Who is the right person to lead an organization, and to what extent does their background or experience need to figure in that assessment? I think that's the right and important and explicit debate that we should be having, and discussion that we should be having in our society.
So thank you so much, Sam Gill. And I should note, for those who have more questions to ask, Sam's going to be joined by two co-authors of the statement on ideological pluralism, or on philanthropic pluralism, Darren Walker of Ford Foundation and Brian Hooks of Standing Together and the Charles Koch Foundation. They'll be speaking, or they'll be in a conversation at Aspen Ideas this in July. So in late June and early July. So please join us then. Sam, thank you so much. And thank you to the audience and for your questions.
Thanks, Jane. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Aspen, and thanks to everyone who joined. And I look forward to your feedback and further thoughts. It's great to have such an engaged audience.
Thanks so much.
Take care.